Greetings and welcome to the third class in this second semester of the Emerald Choral Academy. I am Gary Cannon, the Artistic Director of the Emerald Ensemble, a professional choir based in Seattle. The Emerald Choral Academy is a series of interactive webinars during which our area's leading professional choristers reveal their personal tricks of the trade to community singers. These webinars are then made available freely to singers across the world via YouTube. The Emerald Ensemble is very grateful to our generous donors and organizations who have made this project possible for 2 years now, including For Culture and the Seattle Office of Arts and Culture. We encourage anyone participating or viewing this webinar to make a donation as you are able at emeraldensemble.org. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel and join our mailing list to hear about future sessions of the Academy and the other activities of the Emerald Ensemble. This webinar is being recorded. By participating, you are granting the Emerald Ensemble permission to share your contribution. Your microphones and cameras will remain off for the duration of the presentation. You can, however, ask questions to the presenter by typing into the chat or Q&A features at the bottom of your screen. And then periodically, I'll interject to field your questions. Today's instructor, Michael Bennett, has sung extensively as a freelancer on both American coasts. Currently, he is a PhD candidate in musicology at the University of Washington, and he teaches remotely at the Concord Academy in Massachusetts. Michael is one of those overachievers who is far too good in far too many fields. It's just not fair. Already he has degrees in music theory and composition, and he has extensive experience in choral conducting and musical theater as well. And he shared his expertise in linguistics through an Emerald Choral Academy presentation just last year. But today we are limiting him to just one topic, and that is music theory for choral singers. It's a great pleasure to introduce to you my colleague, Michael Bennett.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. It's great to be back here after participating in these workshops last year. And yes, today we are covering a broad topic, but we're going to try to get as much information as possible in this short time. Music theory is, of course, a wide field that as you heard, you can get an entire degree in with many years of coursework. But today, in this 30 minutes, we'll try to get as much as we can, particularly the kind of fundamentals that are essential for success in the choral rehearsal for a chorister. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can everyone see the slides? Okay. So, just to give a little bit of an overview of what we're going to look at today, we're going to cover keys and key signatures. This is kind of how we organize the tonal material of music that we sing most of the time. We'll look at some scales and the idea of scale degrees. We're going to cover intervals, which is the distance between pitches. We'll look at triads, the kind of basic chord that is used in most tonal music, and the kind of principles of harmony. And if time allows, we'll even get to some cadences, which is the way that we come to harmonic closure at the end of phrases. So to begin, we'll think about keys. And I've said you're either in or you're out. If you're not super familiar with music theory, you may at least have heard, oh, that's not in key, or this note falls outside of the key. So this is what we're talking about when we talk about tonal music, as opposed to atonal music. Tonal music is organized into a series of keys. So just to get us started, for those who this may be new to, we have the musical alphabet is made up of these 7 notes that repeat. So the letters A through G. And as you go up the musical scale, you have A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And then you cycle back around and start at A. And this continues, ad infinitum. So this can be visualized on the staff. We use the grand staff to create an essentially seamless flow of notes across two staves with C, middle C, in the middle of these two staves. So you have the bass clef for the lower pitches and the treble clef for the upper notes. So as you can see, this scale is written from C to C, but the letters of the alphabet just repeat once you cycle through. Now, what this doesn't show, and this is a frustrating element of music and reading music, is that while all of these notes appear to be equidistant, it goes line space across the staves, they are actually not all equidistant. The space between the notes is not the same. And this is a tricky thing that you just kind of have to memorize about the way that music works. So there are actually, this is best visualized on a piano keyboard. There are half steps. Some of the distance between the letters of this musical alphabet are what we call whole steps, meaning that there is a note in between. So for instance, between A and B, you have a whole step. There is an A sharp or a B flat that exists between A and B. However, between B and C, there is no additional note there. So that would be what we call a half step. So the letters of the musical alphabet are arranged in whole steps and half steps. And we have this little formula that we use, for instance, between C and C, we see it goes whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. And you may be aware that if you go up the scale from a C to a C, this is what we call the major scale. So I can play that for you. Hopefully you're able to hear that. That's our C major scale. And that's, again, we sing that all the time, maybe on solfege. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. We kind of do it instinctively, but what we may not realize is actually that the distance between mi and fa and ti and do is smaller than the distance between the other notes. So to show how this works, if we weren't starting on C, say we were starting our scale on G, if we were to go just proceeding up the white notes of the piano, we wouldn't have that same whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half ratio or formula of the major scale. And so we have to alter one of the pitches when we get there. So you see, it goes along really well until the very end, where we would have E to F would be a half step where we want a whole step, and F to G would be a whole step where we want a half step. So in order to rectify that situation, we raise the F to an F sharp, and that creates a whole step between E and F and a half step between F sharp and G, which is what we want. So this is why in the key of G, we need one sharp, the F sharp. Another example here is if we were to start on F. So as you go up the piano or up the scale here, we have whole, whole, and then the next would be A to B. That would be a whole step. So in order to make a half step, which is what we need, we have to shrink that B down to a B flat, creating a half step between A and B flat. This also solves the problem on the other side, which is that B to C would normally have been a half step. Now it's a whole step. And so that gives us this formula that we want of whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. So in the key of F, we need one flat. So this is where we start talking about key signatures. So when you look at a piece of choral music at the very beginning of the page, right with all the clefs and the tempo and everything, there is this key signature generally. And so you can, this is what's indicating what key we're in. All right, so now as you see here, there are 15 different major keys that we could potentially be in with all of these accidentals. And while you could simply memorize them, which is one method to knowing all of these key signatures, there is a shortcut for both sharps and flats. And that's what I'd like to go over now. So if you're looking at a key signature that has sharps, the way to tell the key that you're in is to look at the last sharp and go up a half step or to the next note, basically, of the musical alphabet. So here, the last sharp is E sharp. If we lead up one half step from that E sharp, we get to F sharp. And so this is the key of F sharp major. If you look down here at this key signature, we have two sharps. The last sharp here is C sharp. So if you go up one letter of the musical alphabet from C to D, that indicates that we're in the key of D. So if you can think about a sharp, the way I like to think about it is it's pointing upward, so that can help remind you, or a sharp rather kind of raises the note. So you can look at that last sharp and go up one half step. Now, the trick for flats, if you're looking at a key signature made up of flats, generally that means that you're going to be in a key that has a flat note as its tonic. So it's the key of some letter of the alphabet flat. And the way to know which key you're in is to look at the second to last flat. So flats are arranged in a particular order from left to right. And in this case, we have the last flat here is A flat, but if we go back one to E flat, this is the key signature for the key of E flat major. So if you can think about flats as lowering or falling back, you can fall back to the second to last flat, and that will tell you the key that you're in. So similarly down here, we've got 4 flats. This is again in a bass clef. And if you go back from the last flat that we have here, which is D flat, if you just go back to the flat before, that's A flat. So this is the key of A flat major that we're looking at. So let's try putting this into practice just to, but before we do that, you may be thinking, well, if there's only one flat, there's no second to last flat. And this is one that you just kind of have to remember, and it's F. And you can think of, I like to think of F for flat. So if you see one flat on the page, it's the key of F major. Now let's practice. So I've included some excerpts, some choral hits from the choral repertoire. So here we have the opening to the Hallelujah chorus. If you are a chorister, you've been given this piece, and you look over at the left-hand side here, and we've got 2 sharps in the key signature. Remember, sharps is the one where you go up from the last sharp. And so here the C sharp points up to D. So in this case, we are in the key of D major for the Hallelujah chorus. Here's a Bach Chorale. If we're looking at this over again, we look at the key signature. We've got 3 flats. For flats, we look at the second to last flat. And so going backwards from this last flat of A flat, we look back and we see E flat is the second to last flat. So this particular chorale is in the key of E flat. One more. Here we have the Rachmaninoff Ave Maria, the Bogorodice Dievo, and looking at the key signature, we see 1 flat. Now remember, this week there is no second to last in this case, so this is our example of where we have to just remember that we are in the key of F, F for flat, for 1 flat. Okay. Good, so that is the basic idea for keys. And this is maybe a good place to pause and see if there are any questions about that concept.
Nope, no questions, but thank you for teaching me F for flat. I have never thought of that before.
There you go, yes, yes, it's a great little shortcut.
Yeah.
Okay. So moving on, we're sort of already talking about this, but if we look at a scale, what is a scale really? In the broadest terms, it's an ordered set of musical notes from one pitch to that same pitch in an octave higher or lower. And there can be any number of notes in between. So we have different scales of different numbers of notes. And so the one that we're most familiar with is the diatonic 7-note scale. So one concept that I want to introduce is this idea of a scale degree. So there are 7 degrees of a diatonic scale, so however many notes you have. And so the first note of the scale is the first scale degree, and then the second note is the second scale degree. We also know them by solfege syllables. And at least in the United States, we use what's called movable dough. So no matter what key you're in, whether you're in E flat or F sharp major, the first scale degree we call do. This is not the practice in Europe and Asia. They use what's called fixed do, where C is always do. And there are benefits to that system. However, I think movable do really helps in terms of thinking about the relationship between all of the notes in the scale. Our solfege can help orient us within a key if you know where do is all the time. The members of the scale degrees, also have very fancy names, as you can see on the bottom of the slide. So the first scale degree is called the tonic, and the second scale degree is called the supertonic, just above the tonic. These are not necessarily names that you need to know, all of them. I think maybe the most important would be to know the dominant, which is the fifth scale degree. We often talk about the relationship between the tonic and the dominant, the sort of do and sol. They have this kind of polar relationship where within tonal harmony, we're often going back and forth between those two areas. So it's good to know about the dominant. And then the leading tone is maybe a term also that you are familiar with. So that leading tone is that last scale degree that's only 1/2 step away from the tonic or from do. And in the case of, for instance, a sharp, when you're looking at those sharp key signatures, it means that that last sharp actually is the leading tone of the key. So it's that 7th scale degree that leads up to the tonic. Okay, so particularly tonic and dominant are good ones to know. Some other scale types that you should be familiar with. The chromatic scale, chroma means is the root meaning color. And so, in the original concept of the word, it was adding color to notes that fell outside of the key or the mode. And so this idea of the chromatic scale is all half steps. So if you were to walk right up the piano, okay, that is an example of a chromatic scale. We've already talked about the major scale, which is that whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. And when it comes to minor, the minor scale, it gets a little more complicated. We have multiple different kinds of minor scales to know about. The sort of most common and the most natural, this is what it's called, the natural minor, is what we use. Sometimes people approach it in what's called law-based minor. So if you were to sing, so we know do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. If you went down and started on la of that same set, so if this was my do, ti, la, ti, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, that is the natural minor scale. And we call it the relative minor because it uses the same key signature. I like to think of, relatives, someone that you're related to, they share the same, a lot of the same DNA. So in the case of scales, I like to think of, the same pitch collection for the same, the major and its relative minor. So they use the same notes and the same key signature. And I'll explain what I mean by that for the key signature in just a moment. There's also what's called the parallel minor, which is where do is the same for both. So for instance, you have the key of C major and then C minor. So starting on the same do. And in that case, you have to alter your solfege syllables because you have lowered some of the pitches. So the 3rd, 6th, and 7th scale degrees are lowered. And we have to alter our solfege as well. So mi becomes me, la becomes lay, and ti becomes te. So you have do, re, me, fa, sol, lay, te, do. Okay, so that's what's called the parallel minor. It has the same keynote, the same tonic, and importantly also the same dominant. So we retain those, and this is why people often prefer do-based. That you can get into heated arguments about which is better, law-based or do-based minor. But I think at least for do-based minor, you retain that identity of the tonic and of the dominant. And so harmonically, it can be more helpful to keep thinking about the same do. All right, so then these other two kinds, these are less common, but it's worth knowing about them. The harmonic minor raises that leading tone back up to its original position of T. So you have do, re, mi, fa, sol, lay, ti, do. But that creates a wide augmented second interval between lay and T. It's actually the equivalent of a minor third. And so there's also the melodic minor, which raises both La and T to avoid that awkward augmented second. So you have Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, Ti, Do. So it's bright and as you ascend up to that Do, but on the way down, because the leading tone is no longer leading upward, you can lower those altered pitches back down to the natural minor. So in melodic minor, it's just natural on the way down. Do, te, le, sol, fa, me, re, do. Okay, so those are our types of minor scale. And so now, when I say that the relative minor uses the same key signature, here's what I mean. If you were to look at a C scale and you know that in order to convert C major to C minor, you have to lower the 3rd, 6th, and 7th scale degrees for the natural minor. If you take those accidentals and you throw them onto a key signature, you see that you're actually using the same key signature as you would for E flat major, right? Using our second to last flat rule. And so you could actually think of this 3rd scale degree as Do in the key of E flat, and that the C of C minor is the La, it's the 6th scale degree of the E flat major scale. So there's your La-based minor, La, Ti, Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La. So this is why actually our little shortcut that I gave you before only works for major key signatures. And so what you have to get good at is determining whether or not a piece is actually in the major key or the minor key. And so how do we do that? Oh, here's the chart. You may have heard of the circle of fifths. Again, you could sit here and memorize the relative minors of every single major key. Again, this would take you a while. And so even though you're just going back a minor third or going back down to the La of the tonic Do. But instead, what you should be thinking about is using context clues. So here I have another example. This is the opening of the Fauré Requiem. Looking at the key signature, we see 1 flat. Normally that would indicate to us that this is in the key of F major. However, most pieces we'll find in tonal music begin with a tonic chord. In other words, they begin on the chord that's based on the 1st scale degree, Do. And it's usually in the bass. It's usually all, this is kind of one of the rules of harmony, is that most often chords appear in root position. And so that means that the root, the bottom note of the chord is on the bottom. And if you look down here at the bass, there's a D in the bass. So we have the notes D, F, and A. And that creates, that is actually, we would be expecting if we were in F major to see F, A, and C. We'll talk about this a little more when we get to triads. But what we get in the opening of the Fauré Requiem is this big D minor chord. And so we can see actually this is not in F major, but rather in D minor. Here's another example that you may be familiar with. This is Eric Whitaker's Luxorumque. The key signature over here would indicate that we would potentially be, if we looked at the last sharp and went up a half step, we would be in the key of E major. However, as you can see, the bass and lots of other members of the ensemble are singing a C sharp. And that C sharp is indicating that's that minor third below, that's the La of E major. So we're actually in C sharp minor at the beginning of this piece. Okay, so this is one we have to kind of use context clues to let us know whether we're in the major key or its relative minor. Okay, this is another great place to pause if there are any questions in the chat.
I'm double checking in case I missed one. Nope, I think we're good. Although now all this talk about dough-based things makes me want a pastry, but otherwise I'd say we're good to continue.
Okay, great. All right, so I wanted to briefly cover intervals because this is something that we think about as choral singers a lot. Basically, what is the distance of the pitch between you and another member of the choir, or even between you and a note in the accompaniment that might help you find your pitch. So when we talk about intervals, we have to talk about both their quantity, which is sort of the size, the general size of the interval, and then their quality. So when we talk about interval quantity, that's pretty straightforward. It's just the distance of lines and spaces or letters of that musical alphabet that we are apart. So obviously the same note is a unison. A note and its same pitch, 8 notes higher is the octave, right? So we're singing the same note, but in 2 different octaves. And then everything in between, whether it's one note, if it's, you know, it's just 2 notes, or you know, this gets a little confusing because it's 1 note away, but it's called a second, right? Because the distance, if you count 1, 2 between the notes, and then a third would be 1, 2, 3. It's that third away from the original pitch, and so on and so on. 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th. These will always retain that identity of their quantity, no matter if there are any accidentals or anything involved. It's always going to be called by its quantity name. Now, then we have to think about what's called quality. So one of the ways to start thinking about interval quality is based on the intervals of the major scale. So we see some, as you're looking here, there are some intervals that are called perfect and some that are just called major. So that you see that the unison, the 4th, 5th, and octave, we call perfect. There's a variety of reasons going all the way back to ancient Greece that these intervals are called perfect. Yes, it goes back to Pythagoras, who you may know from a squared plus b squared equals c squared. He was also a music theorist and had some ideas about, you know, frequencies and intervals. But in this case, it's just good to know that I think one of the key features is that in both major and minor keys, the unison, the octave, the 4th, and the 5th, those intervals are always the same, whether you're in major or minor key. Now, the intervals of the 2nd and the 3rd and the 6th and the 7th, those are what we call major intervals. If you go from do to re, or do to mi, or do to la, do to ti, we call those the major. And I'm just realizing this this actually isn't my image, but this should say major 7th here for the do to the leading tone. Okay. Now, what about all the other notes, right? So that kind of covers all of the white notes, if you will, like, you know, but there are all those other pitches. And so here's an example, a kind of full list of all of the possible chromatic intervals from C to every other note on the piano up to C. So you can see that if it's a half step, we also call that a minor second, right? So rather than do to re, if you have that lowered re, that would be a minor second, or a minor third. Instead of do mi, it's that do me from the minor scale. One pair of intervals that I want to point out here is the augmented 4th and diminished 5th. So C to F sharp and C to G flat. Those are actually the same interval. They're enharmonic equivalents of one another. That means they're spelled differently. We use different notes to represent them, but on the piano, they're exactly the same, okay? And then we call that the tritone. It equally divides the octave in terms of half steps. So so we can see that, you know, we have minor 6th and minor 7th in addition to their major versions as well. Now, you may be thinking, well, you know, so these only occur when we use accidentals. Actually, most of these minor intervals are a part of the diatonic major collection. If you go from every note of the scale to the upper do, as opposed to going from the lower do. So you can see the distance between T to upper do is a minor second, and the distance from la to upper do is a minor third, and we get minor 6th and minor 7th on the bottom as well. And so from mi to do and from re to do. So if you flip those intervals around, their quality changes from major to minor. Okay, so we do actually encounter these minor intervals even in major keys. Okay, I'm gonna go on to triads and then pause after triads. So A triad. What is a triad? So now that we know about intervals, a triad is a chord. So a chord generally is made up of more than 2 notes. And if we have a 3-note chord that is made up of 2 stacked thirds, that's a triad. So what do I mean by that? So for instance, C to E would be a third, and then E to G would be another third, because they both skip 1 note in between. And so on the, it would look like this on the piano, and on your page, it would look like this. Looks like a little a snowman or something like that, right? So it's got these 3 segments that are equally spaced on the staff. Now, of course, we also know that these could go all the way up the scale. We could make these triads to infinity, but as we know, the notes are not all equally spaced when we're going up a scale, right? We know about E and F and B and C. These are these natural half steps. So it's also true that the distance between the bottom note and the middle note, and the middle note and the top note, is not always the same, depending on where this triad sits on the staff. So there are 4 primary types of triads. The most common that you would encounter would be major and minor. So a major triad has a major third on the bottom and a minor third on top, whereas a minor triad is just the opposite of that. So a minor third on bottom, major third on top. An augmented triad is made up of 2 major thirds. So again, it looks the same in terms of the kind of snowman shape, but the upper third has been widened so that we have 2 major thirds. And then similarly, a diminished triad is spelled like a triad. So we still have C, E, G, but this G is not just once flatted, but twice flatted. And so we have 2 minor thirds, and this is what's called a double flat. And some people often ask, why do we have double flats? Why do we have double sharps? Part of it has to do with what we're looking at right here, which is the fact that a triad can't be a triad if it's not a stacked third. So even though this enharmonically would work out to being C, E flat, F, if we spelled it that way on the page, it would no longer be a triad, because it would be a third and a second, as opposed to two stacked thirds. So we actually need to use those double flats and or double sharps to achieve to kind of maintain the identity of the triad. Okay, so now, as I said, as we go up the scale, we don't have the same distance between all the pitches. And so the quality, this is what we refer to as the triad quality of the different members of the scale. If you were to build a triad on each member of the major scale, for instance, that's what we're looking at here. And you can see the Roman numerals here, they correspond to the number of the scale degree. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But we're using case here to indicate quality. So uppercase is for major and lowercase is for minor. So you can see that the tonic triad is a major chord, whereas the supertonic, the triad built on the 2nd scale degree, is minor. Okay, and then it proceeds like that, minor for 3, major for 4, major for 5. And this is why if you've ever heard, 1, 4, 5, are kind of the building blocks of most pieces. Those are the 3 major chords in any key, 1, 4, and 5. Those are the major triads. And so if you want to have a piece that sounds happy, it uses only major chords, those are your only options, okay? You'll also see that the leading tone triad, the triad built on 7, we have this little degree symbol. That is the symbol for diminished. So that's actually the only place where a diminished chord exists kind of in a tonal context. So it's pretty rare that we have a triad built on the leading tone, but not totally impossible. Okay, just to say one other thing about the triad is that the 3 components of a triad are called the root, the third, and the fifth, just kind of naming the intervals there. But the note that the triad is built on is called the root. And when you are a choral singer, generally, if you scan up and down your page, we're generally singing in 4 voices. So at almost all times, you will have a complete triad being sung. So here's an example of the Thomas Tallis motet, If You Love Me. And you can see as you look up, we have F, A, C, F on the very first chord. So that F, A, C is your triad, and then we have a doubled note. So often there'll be one pitch that's doubled, okay? Here on the word love, we've got C, E, G, but we have two Cs, okay? And it's often the tonic, or often the root, I should say, that is doubled in these cases. So same thing here. We have, not in order, but F, A, and C. And so we can scan quickly and see, am I singing the root? Am I singing the third? And am I singing the fifth? And this is, it's sometimes good to know, like, which member of the chord you have at any given moment. The other thing that we can do with this is do what's called a Roman numeral analysis, where all of these triads fit into the scale that this piece is based on, 1 flat for F. So we could go through, and this is this theoretical thing called Roman numeral analysis, where you label every single chord according to which scale degree the root is, basically. And then you can indicate its quality as well with your case. Okay. Questions about triads and analysis?
You know, Michael, I really appreciate how condensed everything is, and you make it sound so logical. When I first learned this, I didn't learn most of this until I was actually as an undergraduate, and this, you know, you've just taught 3 months of music theory in half an hour. It's fantastic. When you were talking about identifying the root of chords, I suppose I can put my face up here. Although they're all looking at the thing anyway, so never mind. When you're talking about the root of the chords, and maybe you'll get to this, that's something that's especially nice to be able to identify, to find a starting pitch.
Yes.
It's for everybody. So you may look at the piano introduction that might have strong FAC, and you can not only steal your pitch, but know if it's the root, if it's, say, the bottommost pitch that'll come in. So that's, I think, where this can be especially handy. Singers beware.
That's right. Yes. And I was just, I do have a slide on inversions in just a second.
Oh, cool.
But it's important to know that no matter how the notes are scrambled in terms of the vocal arrangement, you can always distill them down. There's only one way that they stack into thirds. So that's what we're always looking for, is if I think about the musical alphabet, you know, A through, it's sort of, if you think about this slide here with this kind of every possible triad here starting on every note, like there's only one way that your notes are going to arrange in thirds, and it's going to be one of these 7 options, right? So just kind of being savvy with the musical alphabet and knowing which note is going to be the root.
Yeah, thank you for bringing into, also in the context of Renaissance music with Tallis.
Yeah,
kind of before modern harmony was established, but the idea of the chords and chord behaviors was still there, and this, especially in singing early music, which I've done quite a bit of professionally, and I can't tell the number of chords. Times I look and see where the chord is built and how it all behaves, even before this allegedly was invented, or while it was still
yes. It's very good that you do mention that. There was a system of harmony that was based on modes, the old church modes, that was in effect through the Renaissance, well into the 17th century. And so it is good. This is a bit of an anachronism to use this Tallis example, but it's so triadic. You can see this is you know, Tallis and Byrd. They're late 16th century, and so they're already kind of starting to think more homophonic and less polyphonic, which necessitates this kind of triadic writing.
And even earlier with Palestrina and earlier folks, even into Josquin quite a lot. So we're looking now circa 1500. The notion of the triad was still crucial, even if the way that one triad behaved relation to the next did not yet. Okay, I'll quit this aside and let you get back to the good stuff. Thank you.
Okay, so now it would be all too simple if and boring, quite frankly, if at all times choral music or any classical music was made up of just triads. So there are places where if you were to scan your music vertically, you actually would not find a triad. You may be singing a note that doesn't fit into a certain kind of triad. And so there's a variety of what we call non-chord tones. And particularly in the common practice era, this kind of like the 17th and 18th, 19th centuries, there are certain types that can be named and identified. We're not going to go over those today. But I bring up this Bach Chorale one more time because Bach is a great example of places where he is embellishing a simple kind of the structure is this triadic harmony, and then he is creating tension and release by using what are called non-chord tones. So if I'm the bass in measure 3 of this chorale, you can see already in the second bar that the basses are on the move in the opening of this chorale. And so when they descend, so on the downbeat of measure 3, we do have a triad. It's an E flat triad, so E, G, B in the upper voices, and the basses have a G, which is the third. But then they move to this F, okay, and so now we have that harmony, which that F doesn't belong, okay? And then actually in the next beat, the other voices move to B, tenors have B flat, altos F, sopranos B flat. And that's kind of setting us up, B flat to F. We're looking for a D in the middle to kind of complete our snowman, our triad. But on the chord change, the basses have a B flat, or an E flat rather. And then they resolve to the D that we've been waiting for. Okay, but for that brief moment, they're actually not singing a member of the triad. These are passing tones. So basically Bach is filling the gap from this G at the beginning of the bar to the D at the end of the bar with the two notes that go in between, and intentionally creating a little bit of dissonance. And so these are the moments that choral conductors want singers to bring out, especially if you have, you've probably heard, if you have moving notes, bring them out. This is like a major moment for the basses in this chorale. It's actually quite unusual because the basses tend to have just kind of, even in Bach, tend to have the kind of structural harmony notes. But in this case, they have this wonderful melodic line that's very stepwise. And so it's nice to bring those out, especially when they create dissonance with the other parts. For a more modern example, I've given an example of Martin Lauridsen, who is famous for using these kind of what we call added note chords or added note harmonies. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you look at the downbeat of O Nata Lux, you can see there's a little bit of a cluster. The altos have both D and E. But if we analyze all of the notes that you see here, we can arrange them into thirds of D, F, A. Most voices have DFA, so the D in the alto, F sharp in the bass and soprano, and an A in the tenor. So that's a D chord, and it makes sense because our key signature is also showing us D. However, the altos are singing an E. Okay, so they have what's called an added 9, or it's a ninth above the bass note, which would be the root, which would be D. Okay, so there's this added note in the harmony. Similarly, on this downbeat of the second bar, now you see, if we analyze that according to thirds, the tenors have an A, the basses have a C sharp, and the sopranos have an E. So that's an A chord, okay, an A major triad. But again, the altos, they have a note that lies outside of the triad, and it creates this really pretty dissonance. That is what we love about Lauridsen's music. So these are added note chords. The reason I've highlighted the bass here is to show that in Lauridsen, again, this is very common for his writing style, the chords, the triads that we get appear almost never in root position, meaning the basses almost never have the root note of the chord. In this case, the basses are often singing the third in this case, so, and then when we change, and then on the downbeat of measure 3, they have the fifth. That would be a D chord, D, F sharp, A, but the basses have the A. So it's the same harmony, but it's sort of a less stable and more interesting kind of way of voicing that harmony. Okay, so those are inversions and more non-chord tones. Okay, very briefly, I just wanted to point out the idea of cadence. You may be familiar with this term as a kind of musical or harmonic resting point within a phrase. There are different types of cadences. For instance, usually cadences are trying to get us back to our home key of the tonic, so the one chord. So an authentic cadence, this is the kind of most basic, okay, the sort of basic relationship between the 5 and the 1. So that motion from a 5 chord to a 1 chord is called an authentic cadence. If you were to instead go from the 4 chord back to the 1 chord, that's what we call a plagal cadence, or an amen. We often hear that in hymns, at the ends of hymns. Okay, a 4 to 1. Deceptive cadence is when you're expecting the 1 chord, like usually it's the 5 chord going, when you hear a 5 chord, you just know to expect the 1 to follow. But sometimes there are special cases where we get a harmony other than 1. And that's, it's very surprising and delightful to hear because it subverts our expectations of where the harmony is going. And so we've been deceived. And this is usually going from the 5 chord to 6 rather than to 1. And then a half cadence would be usually in the middle of a phrase where we are resting on the 5, and that's usually followed by another phrase where you're going to end on the 1 instead of ending on the 5, just to kind of balance out those two, because we're always trying to get back to the home base of the tonic chord. So just again to show you, here's my Tallis example. Again, this is a bit anachronistic because Tallis wasn't thinking necessarily in terms of these kinds of chord harmony relationships, but the opening of this piece gives us a really great example of first an authentic cadence and then a plagal cadence. So we have F going, let's see, we have a 5-1 cadence on Love Me. And then on mandments of commandments, you can see it's 4 going to 1. And all of these harmonies are in root position. So you can see really clearly 1, 6, 5, 1, and then we have 4, 1 on the mandments. An example of a deceptive cadence that I thought of was toward the end of Mozart's Ave Verum. On Examine, we get this this harmony that we're not expecting. We're expecting, when we get to Mortis Examine, we want it to go like back to home base. Instead, he not only doesn't he go to the tonic, he doesn't go to the 6 either. He goes to a 4 chord in inversion, which is very unusual, but it's a lovely effect here. So we know that is a G chord. We're expecting a D chord, and instead we get a G chord in first inversion. So it's a delightful surprise when we get to that moment in the piece, and that's part of the joy of a deceptive cadence. So just wanted to touch on that. It's important to note these are things that we often feel when we get to these kind of resting places within the music. But certain cadences are kind of like final, they're terminal cadences, whereas other cadences continue the music on. A deceptive cadence, we couldn't just end the piece on a deceptive cadence. It's a cadence that wants to then inspire a new phrase to kind of correctly end the phrase, which we do get obviously at the very end of the piece. Similarly, a half cadence, as I said, indicates that we need to go back and do another phrase that's going to kind of finish us with an authentic cadence. So it's just good to know, kind of when we get to those points, what they mean in terms of the harmony and where the music is going. Okay, I think that is it for me, and I'm game for any questions that have come up.
As I'm sure there are going to be more questions typed in shortly, I'm sure. I really appreciate what you're saying about the deceptive cadence and such, and linking that to something said earlier regarding the conductor asking for the moving notes to be louder and that kind of thing. And deceptive cadences are a great example of a place when conductors will often want to slow the tempo slightly or add a diminuendo. And so I'm hoping that some of our attendees today can see the oddities that their conductor may request are very often based on the notes themselves. It's not just some flight of fancy, though that happens too, of course. for some of us more than others. Yeah.
Very Gary.
The other, you also talked about how dull it would be if all pieces of music consisted of only triads. And it reminded me of the story that I heard of a film composer who, I wish I remembered who it was. It was one of the big names, who brought in a score to the director and in the computer version so the director could hear what they're expecting. And the director was furious. He said, no, I only want happy music, only major triads, only major chords and nothing else. And the composer said, that's impossible. It would be very dull. I don't care, only major chords. And of course, then the composer came back a few days later with a version that had more major chords, but not only. And the director said, exactly like that, all major chords. You did exactly what I said. That director needs to watch your presentation here. Scott, do you have anything to add?
You know, I just wanted to talk a little bit about chord function, even relative to inversions. Is, you know, for me as a bass, I mean, my function is, unless I'm singing jazz, my function is always pretty much the same. And every now and then I get a 7th or even 11th or 9th, and I'm like, ooh, cool, something different. Or 3rd, you know, oh wow, we get to, you know, determine whether or not we're major or minor. But knowing your function in the chord as a choral singer is vital, because that's balance and intonation is actually partly influenced by balance, is really important. So I know, for example, if I'm a tenor singing the 3rd, I could probably not be the most important thing in the sound.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
No, you wouldn't, would you, Gary?
As a tenor, no.
Yeah. So I think knowing your chord, knowing your place in the chord is really, really important. And whether or not you are a harmonic function or a non-harmonic function is important too. You know, when you are, that Lordson example that you gave, Michael, knowing that you're a second, you know, you're singing the D in C major, and you've got a, you know, you're one of the unharmonic notes. You're clashy, you're dirty, you know, you're adding the smoke and the sexy to the sound. I don't know how Morton would feel about that, but but knowing where you are in the chord or what your function is really, really important. And Michael, this was amazing. I think I just got my entire first semester of freshman theory refreshed. It's been great. Yeah.
We have another question here too that's come in. Can you review what you mean by the term tritone? And how does it affect the way that you read or sing the music?
Great. That's a great question. Yeah. So this a tritone is a particular kind of interval that you can either be spelled, you know, written on the music as an augmented fourth. So in other words, a perfect fourth that's been stretched by 1/2 step, or a diminished fifth, so a perfect fifth that's been shrunk by 1/2 step. And these are actually, they do occur in every major key. It's the distance between fa and ti. So every, we think of it as a very, very dissonant interval. It's often described as one of the most dissonant intervals. In fact, it was at one time, you know, called the devil's interval because it was so terrible. And yet it exists as part of the major scale that we use. And so it also exists as part of every dominant 5-to-1 cadence that includes a 7th. If it's a 5/7 chord, you have both fa and ti in the same chord. And so there's the interval of a tritone between those two pitches. And so again, it is helpful to know if I have the T of that tritone, I'm really wanting to, you know, it's the leading tone that's going to lead up, and the fa is going to fall down to mi. And so there's this fourth that wants to push out between fa and ti in every 5/7 chord. So those actually do come up quite a bit. But it's still used throughout music, throughout history, to indicate something sinister, something you know, bad, evil. You'll often hear it in those kinds of contexts. But yes, so it's good to know that that's another one of these intervals that does occur even in a major key.
Evil, or even just in alarm, you know, it's
the
European emergency. It's the, in Paris, and you hear that sound, you know, to get out of the way.
Right, or laughter. You know, sometimes you hear that kind of stuff in music.
And
too.
similar, like the diminished triad that you commented, that has a tritone on the outside, and that's the traditional sound of 1920s films, and the evil guy who's twirling his mustache, and the somebody tied up on the
right,
tracks, and you hear this tremolo. Yes, exactly, and then it'll go up by half step.
Yeah.
The only thing I want to add on tritone also is the name of it, tritone, coming from 3 consecutive whole tones. So in that pattern, we had whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. This case would be whole, 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 and you have a tritone that doesn't belong in the scale. Yeah. Let's see. Oh, I see we have one other thing. Oh, this is a big question. Stephanie, this is a great one, about how different types of chords and cadences are now associated with certain emotional responses. And oh, we could do a whole session on the history of I'm literally twirling my hands at the prospect of this, because it's so different now than it was even in Bach's time, when D major meant triumphant, the end. And then Mahler writes his Ninth Symphony, which sure isn't triumphant by any means.
Yes, yeah, there was a period in history, as you mentioned, particularly in the 17th century, where there was this idea of the doctrine of the affections, and that people believed that certain kinds of auditory stimuli, certain kinds of music and chords and harmonies could actually physically affect the body in a certain, and elicit a certain response. And so composers got very into composing music that had a particular feeling or affect in different keys. And so as I was looking, you know, like Vivaldi Gloria is also in D major, and so is the Hallelujah Chorus. These are very triumphant keys. It also has to do with the instruments that would play in a more jubilant thing. So brass instruments at this time did not have valves, and so there were only, certain brass instruments were pitched in certain keys. And so if you wanted to use those instruments, you had to basically write the piece in that key. And the same thing with the string instruments. You know, if you're in the key of D, those are all open strings on a violin. You know, D, A, E, G, those all fit into the key of D without having to put any fingers down. And so you can have a very bright, vibrant, unadulterated kind of sound coming from the string instruments, and that's used for different.
Yeah, and some of the others I've always been, E flat as sober and somber and solemn, but that one not so much because of the instruments, but because it had 3 flats, which was deemed to be reflective of the Trinity.
The Trinity, yeah.
Just the emotion became overlaid on this arbitrary aspect of 3 flats. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, I don't see any other questions coming in at this point. Michael, thank you very much. This was wonderfully informative and succinct. It's the kind of one I expect that people may want to rewatch a few dozen times, in 5-minute snippets or something like that. It's fantastic.
It's a lot, as you said. This was a review of an entire semester's worth of material. So,
right.
Yeah.
And we have 3 more years of music theory we could cover in these if we.
That's right.
The next offering of the Emerald Choral Academy will take place on Monday, April the 12th, when baritone Ryan Beatty will teach us how to handle vocal emergencies. I've been singing professionally for 25 years, and I look forward to finally learning how to handle vocal emergencies. We at the Emerald Ensemble are grateful for the enthusiasm of you, our audiences and supporters. As the Emerald Choral Academy continues, you can help to support these efforts by donating at emeraldensemble.org. And you can also let us know of topics that you would like to see discussed in the future. In the meantime, I am Gary Cannon, and on behalf of all the Emerald Ensemble, I wish you good physical, mental, and musical health. Thank you.